Last time we spoke about and we focused on the great revolutionary year 1989 and the impact that it had on Central and Eastern Europe. The first immediate impact was 1991, the collapse of communist rule, and not only communist rule, but the Soviet Union. And we looked in general about how the revolutions of 1989 affected each of the areas where Carpatho-Rusyns live in the various countries. And that included Ukraine, Transcarpathia, where the largest number live. I'll raise this up a little bit. And I also mentioned how Ukraine, in the year 1991, declared its full independence in August and called for a referendum on that independence in December 1991, the same month, the end of which the Soviet Union collapsed. The referendum on independence and the referendum on specifically autonomy for Transcarpathia, together with the very emergence of an independent Ukraine. I'm focusing on Ukraine in this first lecture, that is Carpatho-Rusyns in Ukraine, after 1989, the post-communist era. The second lecture today will be on Carpatho-Rusyns in Slovakia. And then our last lecture will deal with Poland and a summary next week, or 2 weeks from now. So this independence of Ukraine brought a kind of hope. Someone trying to get in? Oh. Yes. Someone is trying to come in. We thought you couldn't make it. You're carrying food, which of course you're not going to eat during class. Good. Good. What are you eating? Or what will you be eating?
A taco salad from Robots.
A taco salad from where?
Robots.
Oh, Robots. I thought that was a library. That's now become a restaurant, I see. We are being serious here today before you came in, and we're going to continue with the seriousness, sir. So, we have independent Ukraine, and Carpatho-Rusyn activists there in Transcarpathia, historic Subcarpathian Rus, were hopeful that in this autonomous province, which they voted for in the referendum, would resolve the nationality question, and that the self-governing region, should it become an actual self-governing region, would be able to manage the inevitable challenges of moving from a state-owned and state-directed command economy, which was typical for the communist era, to a form of free market economic system after the fall of communism. So there were the hopes. The first disappointment, however, came with the autonomy question. We know that's one of these questions that never goes away. To reiterate what I said last time, no less than 78% of eligible voters in the December 1991 referendum did cast their ballot in the form and in favor of self-government or autonomy. They were asked, 78% said, yes, this is what we want. But the decision on how to implement the result of the vote was within the authority of Ukraine's national parliament in Kiev, the Verkhovna Rada as it is known. And this national parliament simply refused to authorize any kind of self-rule for Transcarpathia. Now, the opposition of the parliament in part reflected the general position of the Ukrainian authorities, one might say society in general in Ukraine, which did not consider Carpatho-Rusyns, that is in terms of language and ethnicity, as anything distinct from the rest of the ethnic Ukrainian population. They were Ukrainians. But despite that, in the wake of Kiev's refusal to implement the December 1991 referendum results, Transcarpathia's Carpatho-Rusyn, especially Russinophile civic activists, especially those in the Society of Carpatho-Rusyns, which was established in 1989 or 1990, they continued to press the autonomy question. Numerous petitions sent to Ukraine's government, to its parliament, Ukraine's parliament, petitions to the European Parliament, petitions to the United Nations. And when these failed to elicit any positive results or even a response, activists in this Society of Carpatho-Rusyns, by then led by a university professor named Ivan Turyanytsia, frustrated with no response, in 1993, under his direction, these activists created what they called a provisional government. For what? A provisional government for a Republic of Subcarpathian Rus. Now, in the end, nothing concrete ever came of this kind of affair of declaring a republic. But as a result of doing so, the Carpatho-Rusyn problem did at least reach the attention of the media, always looking for some kind of nice little story. And here we have a group of people proclaiming a republic. So it reached the attention of the media both in Central Europe and in Western Europe, as well as in Russia and the United States, all of which now prompted Ukraine's government to call on its own experts to investigate the matter and to formulate appropriate policies to deal with what was now dubbed the Rusin question. So it got the attention of the Ukrainian government, who now looks at this as the Rusin question. Now, not unrelated to the issue of possible self-rule, autonomy, for Transcarpathia was the question of the very structure of the new Ukrainian state. It came into being in 1991, but it didn't yet have a constitution and didn't yet know what the structure of this country would be. Wasn't clear, was this new Ukraine to become a centralized state like France, or a federal state like Germany or Austria? Finally, in 1996, Ukraine adopted a constitution for a centralized state. So it followed the French model. This effectively meant shelving the issue of Transcarpathian autonomy, because if you have a centralized state, you don't need any autonomous regions. And so now Ukraine's central authorities could turn to the other aspect of what they dubbed the Rusin question, and that is that other aspect, national identity. Now, this aspect of the question had a larger context. And what was that larger context? Well, the Ukrainian government, independent Ukrainian government, was well aware of the views and activity of the World Congress of Rusyns, which we discussed last time, this international body that came into being in 1991. The government of Ukraine also followed closely the demands for recognition of Carpatho-Rusyns as a distinct nationality that were put forth by these various organizations in Transcarpathia itself, including that Society of Carpatho-Rusyns, and that they had submitted in the form of petitions to United Nations, the European Parliament, and to the government of Ukraine itself. So this is what they were asking for and continually demanding. On the other hand, pro-Ukrainian activists from Transcarpathia, and certainly there were many, as well as pro-Ukrainian activists from neighboring countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland, which we're going to look at. All of them had, since the revolution of 1989, they'd been publishing brochures, newspaper articles, media reports, denouncing what they called political Rusynism. Political Rusynism. This is a phrase that they invented and started to use. Of course, this was viewed as a nefarious phenomenon. And as they said, as a nefarious phenomenon, it was really the work of a few intellectually misguided or politically opportunistic individuals who were funded and in some cases led by Carpatho-Rusyns in North America. By the way, the larger Ukrainian nationalist diaspora in the United States and here in Canada, a force toward which independent Ukraine's government paid a significant degree of deference. They listened very carefully to what the Ukrainian diaspora said. Why? Because they were also helping them with money in various forms. And so the Ukrainian diaspora also joined in these denunciations against the Carpatho-Rusyn movement, calling on the Ukrainian authorities to rid their state of the alleged dangers of political Rusynism. Now, the essence of the Ukrainian understanding was based on two principles. The first was that the East Slavic inhabitants living in the Carpathian region were subdivided into three ethnic groups. And they are marked on here. Lemkos, as you can see there, little one here called Boykos, from their perspective also here, and then the Hutsuls in the far east. These three groups allegedly lived on both the northern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains and the southern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains, and by their language and ethnographic characteristics, both material and spiritual culture, revealed that they comprised an integral part of the Ukrainian nationality. So that was the position of the Ukrainian government as well as the public at large. The second principle had to do with nomenclature, namely that the ethnonym Rusyn was just an older historic name, synonym for Ukrainian. That is, Rusin equals Ukrainian. And that included all Carpatho-Rusyns, even if they called themselves Rusnaks or Lemkos, doesn't make a difference. They're Rusyns, they're Ukrainians. Now, if these facts were accepted, the idea of creating from Rusyns a distinct nationality was, from their perspective, simply a politically inspired attempt to undermine Ukraine as a state, or worse still, to deny even that Ukrainians themselves were a distinct nationality. And so it is in this larger context that in October 1996, just soon after Ukraine adopted its constitution, the president of Ukraine, a man named Leonid Kuchma at that time, he accepted the policy recommendations of a governmental ministry that was asked to look into this Rusyn question. And those recommendations were the following. They came out in the form of a 10-point document. And the document was called The Plan for Resolving the Problem of Ukrainians Rusyns. The Plan for Resolving the Problem of Ukrainian Rusyns. The plan. The old Soviet Union was also constructed on plans, 5-year plans. So now we have, under independent Ukraine, a plan for resolving the problem of Rusyns Ukrainians. By its very name and content, did indeed recall Stalinist and Soviet practice. It called on Ukraine's government to undertake a concerted effort to reinforce the Ukrainian national idea, not only among the inhabitants of its own Transcarpathian region, but also among inhabitants outside Ukraine, in neighboring countries, whether that be in Slovakia, or Poland, or Romania, or Hungary, or Serbia, or Croatia, there where these people may call themselves Rusyns, but who should be made to know that they are Ukrainians. In effect, the government of Ukraine was poised to launch a campaign against the Carpatho-Rusyn movement, both within and beyond the borders of independent Ukraine. In other words, a Rusyn nationality and language, to quote a phrase from the 19th century that applied to Ukrainians, but to quote the phrase now, a Rusyn nationality and language has never existed, does not exist, and will not exist. Now, Ukraine's position on non-recognition of Carpatho-Rusyns, and at times its diplomatic intervention on this issue with neighboring countries, brought it up in meetings with other countries, especially those countries that did recognize Carpatho-Rusyns. All of this provoked ongoing concern among Carpatho-Rusyn communities outside Ukraine, as well as among spokespersons for the governments of those other countries where they live, Czechoslovakia or Poland, whatever. And in fact, there was parliamentary representatives in particular from countries like Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and even the United States that publicly expressed disagreement with Kiev's refusal to recognize Carpatho-Rusyns, and in particular its seeming interference in this matter outside the borders of Ukraine. So, for instance, beginning in 1999, the United States State Department that issued every year country reports on human rights or human rights abuses, listed Ukraine's non-recognition of Rusyns as a violation that needs to be corrected. Now, whereas the Orange Revolution, this occurred in Ukraine in early 2005, which brought a Western-oriented and allegedly democratic president to power in the person of a man named Viktor Yushchenko. So we do have a Western-leaning Ukrainian government here. This also turned the international spotlight on Ukraine's internal problems, including its self-declared Rusyn question. So, for instance, a man named Senator John McCain, head of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate, himself, then later a candidate for president of the United States, a very influential Republican politician, sent a letter to President Yushchenko specifically about the Carpatho-Rusyn issue, calling upon him to do whatever was in his power to resolve this Rusyn problem. The Council of Europe's Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination also expressed in 2006 its concern. Even the Secretariat of Human Rights of the National Parliament of Ukraine itself, the so-called ombudsman, issued an appeal to the government, to its own government, to recognize Rusyns as a distinct nationality. Now, to be sure, opposition to recognition of Carpatho-Rusyns on the part of Ukrainian nationalist forces within Ukraine, and also among the Ukrainian diaspora, despite all of this, remained as strong as ever. But this President Yushchenko was now under international and domestic pressure to act, to do something. And he had, as his presidential spokesperson, a native of Transcarpathia. Interesting. That person's name was Viktor Baloga. And that kind of equation resulted in somewhat of a strange development. Well, in politics, nothing strange. Politics, everything is possible. By the outset of the 21st century, the vast majority of deputies in Transcarpathia's regional assembly, this is the Oblastna Rada, carryover from Soviet times, it's kind of each region in Ukraine, each oblast in Ukraine had its own elected assembly. Well, the vast majority of members of that assembly in Uzhhorod, in Transcarpathia, were opposed to the Rusyn question and to any kind of recognition for Carpatho-Rusyns. Totally opposed. In fact, in the wake of Ukraine's Orange Revolution, virtually all of the deputies were now supporters of the Ukrainian nationalist so-called Orange Coalition that actually had brought Yushchenko to power as president, and that dominated the government in Kiev. So we have, quote unquote, a Ukrainian nationalist government in Kiev under Yushchenko, as well as in this regional parliament, in a regional assembly in Transcarpathia. Now, despite this seemingly otherwise unsympathetic political environment, on March 7th, 2007, on March 7th, 2007, this same Transcarpathian Regional Assembly, pro-Ukrainian almost across the board, that same Regional Assembly voted by an overwhelming majority, 71 in favor, 2 against, 2 abstentions, for what? A proposal was put before them, they voted on it, and that 71 to 2, so to speak, to recognize Rusyns as a distinct nationality on the territory of its competence, which was Transcarpathia. And it also requested that the national parliament in Kiev do the same for all of Ukraine. Now, emboldened by this Regional Assembly's decision on the nationality recognition, Transcarpathia's Carpatho-Rusyn community activists, led by a charismatic Orthodox priest in Uzhhorod, revived the autonomy question. He convened what he called a European Congress of Subcarpathian Rusyns. By the name, this priest was named Dimitry Sydor. So in 2007, same year as recognition, he organizes a European Congress of Subcarpathian Rusyns. And in 2008, this European Congress proclaims, quote, the renewal of Rusyn statehood in the form of a Republic of Subcarpathian Rus, which was supposed to take legal effect on December 1st, 2008. They even issued kind of passports for this new republic. The first honorary citizen that they gave the passports to was none other than Andy Warhol, of course, who had died a long time ago, but, you know, symbolically. Of course, in the end, nothing came of all these somewhat pompous declarations with, at times, overblown threats directed at the Ukrainian state. But particularly provocative was the presence at these European Rusyn congresses in Transcarpathia of Russian national activists from other parts of Ukraine, especially from Crimea, as well as the formal request that they made that Russia be a guarantor of this Republic of Subcarpathian Rus. Now, all of this sure to anger justifiably the Ukrainian government, always concerned about Russian interference in its internal affairs. You have to remember during this whole this is the period when Putin comes to power. He comes to power at the beginning of the 21st century in 2000, and before anything happens, he's testing the waters in Ukraine, puts some pressure on in the Donbass, see what happens, doesn't work, put some pressure on Crimea, doesn't work, goes to Transcarpathia, put some pressure on, doesn't work, and then starts it all over again. This is literally what was going on. So this is not kind of pie-in-the-sky thinking. And so, in that sense, this Rusyn question is drawn into the larger political framework of Russian foreign policy. And that included favorable reactions in the Russian media, Russian journals, Russian television, RT, run special reports on these Carpatho-Rusyns that no one ever heard about. Now suddenly, you know, with these pictures of this priest, Dimitry Sydor and Turyanytsia and their republics and all of this. On the other hand, it provoked a negative response from the more moderate World Congress of Rusyns, which condemned the actions of these Transcarpathian extremists as a political provocation that would set back the Carpatho-Rusyn cause. Let's be clear, however. This is a course in political science, so we have to talk about political developments, but let's get some reality or feet on the ground. The vast majority of Transcarpathia's Carpatho-Rus inhabitants showed little interest and were more likely totally indifferent to such, quote-unquote, political matters. Their primary concern, as for centuries had been the primary concern of their parents and their grandparents and their ancestors, was economic survival. In short, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communist rule may have brought political freedoms, the ability to travel abroad, the promise of democratically elected representative institutions. But in the economic realm, the collapse of the Soviet order was simply disastrous. During the Soviet era, the traditional agricultural and livestock raising economy of Transcarpathia was significantly transformed. We spoke about this when I talked about the communist era. For example, more than 300 new factories were built between 1946 and 1990, that is during the Soviet period. No less than 40% of these were set up in the agriculturally unproductive high mountainous regions, not just in the cities down on the south. And while many of these factories would never have survived in a free market, profit-driven economy, they were sustained by a centralized command economic system in which the state was in this case the Soviet state, was the primary purchaser of goods. Most importantly, these factories provided jobs for large numbers of people who otherwise would be unemployed. Also, we should remember that another aspect of Soviet rule was the creation of a generally well-supported medical system throughout the region. This resulted in improvement in health standards, combined with the traditional desire of Carpatho-Rusyn parents to have several children, and the in-migration of tens of thousands of people from other parts of the Soviet Union produced a veritable demographic explosion. So, if at the onset of Soviet rule there were 776,000 people living in Transcarpathia, by the end of the Soviet era there were 1.2 million. With the end of this Soviet command economy and state support for the economy in the new post-1991 independent Ukraine, most of the factories in the region, in particular in those remote highland areas, simply collapsed within a few years. That factor, together with other factors, problems of property law, unequal tax system, resulted in a catastrophic economic situation, so that by the mid-1990s, just within half a decade of the revolution, unemployment in Transcarpathia ranged between 60 and 90%. 60 and 90%, depending on what part of the country, the province one lived in. The desperate Transcarpathian population this time females as well as males, sought work on a semi-permanent basis by going west. The borders were open. So they went this time west, whether to nearby Hungary or Slovakia, or to particular Prague in the Czech Republic, and as far away as Portugal. And so for the vast majority of Transcarpathia's Carpatho-Rusyns, their lives in independent, albeit democratic Ukraine, took a decided turn for the worse. And since their overwhelming concern was to figure out how to survive economically and support their families, often at menial jobs, whether at home or abroad, they had, and in many cases still have, little time for anything else. Certainly not for esoteric and financially unproductive matters like the autonomy question or the nationality question. Who cares? We got to survive. And so what then has been achieved by the Carpatho-Rusyn movement in Transcarpathia during the now 3 decades since the end of Soviet communist rule? Most of the Carpatho-Rusyn organizations that were established beginning in 1990 already, and since then, have not engaged in cultural activity designed to raise awareness in the population that it comprises a distinct nationality. Instead, the small number of individuals who have joined Carpatho-Rusyn organizations were convinced that as a group, they must first attain political autonomy and then, for their homeland, and only thereafter address cultural and identity issues. So this becomes this question: what comes first in order to achieve? Do you have political autonomy and then you can decide officially how to convince people or develop your culture? Or do you do that first and then move up to demands for political self-rule? There were other organizations in Transcarpathia that were concerned with cultural preservation. Among these were the wide network of amateur and professional folk ensembles, not to mention the expanded educational system, but all of which during Soviet times, as well as in independent Ukraine, accepted the premise and promoted the official view that the indigenous East Slavic inhabitants of Transcarpathia were Ukrainians. Another traditionally important organization that we know from throughout this semester, I've mentioned it several times, was the church. And of course, we know that in Transcarpathia, under communist rule, the Greek Catholic Church was banned and only had the Orthodox Church. Now, after 1989, the Greek Catholic Church is legalized once again, so now we have these 2 churches that represent, to which Carpatho-Rusyns are members. Now, it was common knowledge before the destruction in 1949 of the Greek Catholic Church under the Soviets that that church was closely linked to the nationality question and identity of the local Carpatho-Rusyns. In fact, they were the stalwart supporters of the idea that Carpatho-Rusyns are a distinct people. And as I said, in the waning days of Soviet rule, the Greek Catholic Church was legally reconstituted in September 1989. Now, the expectation of some people that this Greek Catholic Church, in the form of the Eparchy of Mukachevo, might somehow assist the Carpatho-Rusin revival was not realized. Not realized. Almost immediately, the eparchy, the diocese, became internally split between both bishops and those who surrounded them, the high officials of the church, the hierarchs, as well as priests, split between two groups. One group wanted the church to be Ukrainian in orientation, using the Ukrainian language in the liturgy and sermons instead of traditionally the liturgical church Slavonic. And then there was those who by default preferred to maintain, as was the case in the past, the local Carpatho-Rusin orientation and traditions. And that included Church Slavonic liturgy and sermons in the spoken Rusin vernacular. So we have this now split within these two orientations within the Greek Catholic Church. Effectively, the Greek Catholic Church is no longer an instrument of a Carpatho-Rusin identity. The situation with the Orthodox was a bit more complex. That church in Transcarpathia remained within the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. As a result, the Orthodox priests or seminarians who became priests from there, from Transcarpathia, were trained in and maintained close contacts with the Orthodox world of the Moscow Patriarchate, in which Russian is considered the prestigious language and the cultural determinant of their people. So neither church really played a strong role in promoting a Carpatho-Rusin orientation. Because of the political preoccupation of most Carpatho-Rusin activists, cultural work specifically remains very underdeveloped, at least in Ukraine's Transcarpathia. They've never had a Rusin language newspaper that lasted for more than a couple months. There have been some publications, without question, but the impact on the society as a whole is minimal. So, for instance, in contrast to Poland and Slovakia, which we're going to look at, where the Carpatho-Rusin communities are much smaller, in Transcarpathia there have been several efforts, but no success, in creating a generally accepted grammar and the basis for a Rusin literary language. So we don't even have that in Transcarpathia. One exception was, for a few years at the outset of the 21st century, there was a so-called Sunday school program that is extracurricular classes, usually taught in the Rusin language by teachers in state schools, where they taught courses about Carpatho-Rusin history and culture. They were quite popular, this Sunday school program, but it depended exclusively on funding from the Carpatho-Rusin diaspora in North America. I might say primarily from Canada, from wealthy Carpatho-Rusins in Canada. And despite that support, the 24 and at one point as many as 40 classes that had existed in 2010, when the program came to an end, but even those 40 classes at most, hardly able to respond to the needs of a Carpatho-Rusin population in Ukraine's Transcarpathia, which some suggest could have been as high as 800,000. And so in the end, to conclude this discussion, The third Carpatho-Rusyn national revival, which some commentators have used as an epithet to describe developments since the revolutions of 1989, has witnessed only limited results in post-communist Ukrainian-ruled Transcarpathia. We will see the contrast when we return and look at Slovakia.